The letter was sitting on my kitchen table when I got home from the grocery store, and I almost threw it away without opening it. It was one of those plain white envelopes with no return address. My name was written in handwriting I didn't recognize, block letters, careful, like someone who was trying hard not to be identified. I get a lot of junk mail. I'm 67 years old. I live alone in a two-bedroom house in Clarksville, Tennessee, and most of what comes through my mailbox is either prescription reminders or credit card offers I'll never use. I set the groceries down, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the counter staring at it for a minute before I finally picked it up. Inside was a single index card. No greeting. Just 7 words. Your son didn't die in that accident. I had to sit down. My son Joel passed away 3 years ago. April 14th. He was 34 years old, coming home from a camping trip in the Smoky Mountains with 2 of his friends. The state trooper who came to my door that Sunday morning told me a tractor-trailer had crossed the center line on Route 441 near Gatlinburg. Joel's truck took the full impact. They said he died before the ambulance arrived. His 2 friends survived with injuries. I buried my son on a Thursday, and I've not had a single full night of sleep since. So when I read those 7 words, my first instinct wasn't hope. It was anger. I thought it was some kind of sick prank, the kind of thing that happens to grieving parents sometimes, people who get targeted by cruel strangers online. I crumpled the card, threw it in the trash, and went to bed. But I didn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Joel's face. About the last voicemail he sent me the morning of the accident. "Hey Dad, just leaving the campsite. Should be back by dinner. Love you." Which I've listened to probably 400 times since then. About the closed casket of the funeral, which the trooper had explained by saying the impact damage was severe. About how Joel's wife, Colton's mother, had handled everything, the funeral arrangements, the insurance claims, all of it, while I was barely functional. She'd been efficient. Shockingly efficient, I remember thinking at the time. Her name is Serena. She and Joel had been married 6 years when he died. They had 1 son together, my grandson Colton, who was 4 at the time and is now 7. I love that boy more than I know how to say. After the funeral, Serena moved with Colton back to her hometown of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I have seen my grandson exactly 4 times in 3 years, always on her terms, always brief, always with a reason it couldn't be longer. I retrieved the index card from the trash at 2 in the morning. I smoothed it out on the kitchen table and read it again. Then I went to my desk and I started writing down everything I could remember about the weeks before Joel died. Not what I remembered about my grief, what I remembered about him. 3 weeks before the accident, Joel called me on a Tuesday night. That was unusual. He usually called on Sundays. He sounded strange, not sad exactly, more like careful, like he was choosing each word before he said it. He told me he'd been thinking about making some changes, that things at home weren't what he'd hoped, that he was worried about Colton. I asked him what he meant. He said he'd explain more when he came to visit the following month. Then he said something I've thought about many times since. "Dad, if anything ever feels off, trust your gut. You've always had good instincts. Promise me." I promised him. And then I forgot about it in the noise of everything that came after. I couldn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made a decision. I was going to find out who sent me that letter. I don't have a lot of resources. I'm a retired electrician. I have my pension, my social security, and a savings account that I try not to touch. I'm not a detective, but I am 67 years old, I have lived a long life, and I know how to be methodical. I started with what I had. The envelope had a Nashville postmark. That narrowed things down. Nashville is only 45 minutes from Clarksville. Someone had driven to Nashville specifically to mail this, or they already lived there. I called my friend Ray, who worked as an insurance investigator for 20 years before he retired, and I asked him hypothetically what a person would do if they suspected a death hadn't happened the way it was reported. Ray was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Gene, are you talking about Joel?" I hadn't said anything to that effect. He'd heard something in my voice. "Start with the accident report," he told me. "Not the summary they give you, the full report. And find out who was in that truck with him." I knew Joel's friends had been in the truck. Marcus Tilley had a broken collarbone. The other man, I only knew him as someone Joel had met through work, newer in Joel's life, had a concussion and a fractured wrist. I had never spoken to either of them directly. At the time, I was too consumed by grief, and Serena had handled all the communication. His name was Wade Puckett. It took me 4 days and 3 phone calls to track down a number for him. When I finally reached him, there was a pause after I said my name that lasted long enough that I almost thought the call had dropped. "Mr. Callahan," he said carefully, "I'd been wondering if you'd ever call." He was living in Knoxville. He said he couldn't talk on the phone. He asked me if I could drive to meet him. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We met at a diner off I-40 a Tuesday morning when the place was quiet. Wade Puckett was maybe 38, sandy-haired, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept well in a long time either. He shook my hand, and then he looked out the window for a moment before he started talking. He told me that the night before the camping trip, Joel had confided in him. Joel had discovered something on Serena's laptop. He hadn't been snooping. She had asked him to pull up a document while she was in the shower, and he had seen something else open in another window. Financial records. A life insurance policy he hadn't known about, taken out in his name 18 months earlier, with a payout of $1.2 million. The beneficiary wasn't listed as their joint trust. It was listed as a name he didn't recognize. Joel had taken a photo of the screen with his phone. He had shown it to Wade on the drive to the mountains, and he told Wade he was planning to contact an attorney when he got back. He thought Serena might have been planning something. He didn't know what exactly. He said he felt like he was being paranoid, but he couldn't shake it. Then the accident happened. Wade had been in the truck. He was in the back seat. He told me there was nothing wrong with Joel's driving. They were in the right-hand lane going the speed limit when the other vehicle came across. He remembers the impact. He remembers waking up in the ambulance. What he does not remember, what has eaten at him for 3 years, is being told at the hospital that Joel was dead. And then, 2 weeks later, being visited by a man he'd never seen before who told him not to discuss what Joel had shared with him on that drive. The man didn't threaten him explicitly, but he made it clear he knew where Wade lived, knew he had a daughter in 2nd grade, knew his schedule. Wade had stayed quiet for 3 years. He said he was ashamed of it. He said the index card had been his idea of a first step toward fixing that. I sat across from him, and I tried to stay calm. My hands were flat on the table, and I was pressing them down hard. I asked him the question I had to ask. Was my son in that truck when it was hit? Wade looked at me for a long moment. He said he didn't know for certain. He said everything happened fast, and he'd been looking at his phone in the back seat just before impact. He said Joel had been driving, but he couldn't swear, not with certainty, about the moments right before. That was enough to break something open in me. I drove home and I called Ray again. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Gene, you need to get a lawyer before you do anything else. And you need to find out who the beneficiary on that policy was." It took me 2 more weeks and a consultation with an attorney in Nashville named Patricia Odom, who handles fraud cases, before I had a name. The beneficiary on the original policy, which had been quietly amended 3 months after the funeral, was a man named Garrett Sloan. I didn't recognize it at first. Then I remembered. Sloan, Serena's last name before she married Joel, her maiden name. Garrett Sloan, her brother. I had met him once at Joel and Serena's wedding. He had given a toast. He seemed charming. I had not seen him since. Patricia Odom told me that a $1.2 million life insurance payout had been processed 11 weeks after the accident. Serena was listed as Joel's widow. Everything had been filed correctly, documented correctly. On paper there was nothing unusual. But Patricia had contacts. She started asking questions that I couldn't have asked myself. What she found took another 3 weeks to piece together. Garrett Sloan had a prior conviction for insurance fraud in the state of Georgia, a 2009 case involving a staged vehicle theft. He had served 18 months of a 3-year sentence. The conviction was expunged after he completed a compliance program, which is why it didn't show up in a basic background check. Serena had been listed as a character witness at his sentencing hearing. Joel had not known any of this. I am certain of that. Joel was an honest, straightforward man who believed in people. He would not have married someone he thought was capable of what I was now beginning to understand. The man who had visited Wade Puckett and warned him to stay quiet. Patricia tracked him through a phone record Wade had saved, which I didn't know until she asked Wade directly, was a private investigator licensed in Tennessee. He had been hired through a shell LLC. The LLC traced back through 2 layers of paperwork to a business address in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I will not write here about what it felt like to understand what I was beginning to understand. I sat in Patricia's office and I looked at the document she had spread across her desk, and I thought about Joel saying, "Trust your gut" on that phone call, and I thought about a closed casket, and I thought about my grandson growing up in Baton Rouge believing his father was gone. I asked Patricia the question directly. I said, "Is it possible my son is alive?" She said she couldn't answer that. She said what she could tell me was that the evidence warranted a serious investigation by people with more authority than she had. She had already been in contact with a former colleague at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. She wanted my permission to bring them in formally. I gave it to her. The next 6 weeks were the longest of my life. I was told not to contact Serena, not to contact Colton's school, not to discuss anything with anyone. I went to work in my garden. I watched baseball. I called my sister in Murfreesboro 3 times a week and talked about nothing. I lay awake at night and argued with myself. One part of me insisting I was a desperate old man building fantasies. The other part remembering Joel's voice on the phone that Tuesday night, careful and deliberate, choosing every word. Then Patricia called me on a Thursday morning at 7:45 and asked me to come to her office immediately. She met me at the door. She sat me down before she said anything. She poured me a cup of coffee I didn't touch. They had found him. Joel was alive. He was living under a different name in a small town outside of Asheville, North Carolina. He had been placed there voluntarily, not as a victim, but because he had cooperated with a federal witness protection arrangement tied to a separate financial fraud investigation that was already underway against Garrett Sloan at the time of the accident. The accident had been real. Joel had genuinely been injured. Broken ribs, a head laceration, a fractured clavicle. But in the chaos of the scene in the hospital, an arrangement had been made. The TBI and a federal agency had needed Joel alive and untraceable. Serena had not been part of protecting Joel. She had been part of planning something else entirely, something that the real investigation was still unraveling. Joel had been told, that the arrangement was temporary. Months, not years. He had been told Colton would be safe, that it would be over soon, that he would be able to come back. 3 years had passed. He had been trying to find a way to surface without destroying the case they were building. Wade's letter to me had accelerated the timeline. I don't know how to write what happened when I walked into that conference room in Asheville on a Tuesday morning and saw my son sitting at a table. He looked older, thinner. He had a beard he didn't have before. He stood up when I came in and I saw his face and I couldn't say anything. I crossed the room and I put my arms around him and we stood there like that for a long time. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I told him to stop talking. Serena was arrested 4 days later on charges of conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, filing a false death certificate, and obstruction. Garrett Sloan was arrested in Baton Rouge the same morning on the federal financial fraud charges that had been building for 2 years. The private investigator who had intimidated Wade surrendered to authorities voluntarily through his attorney and accepted a plea agreement in exchange for testimony. Colton is now living with Joel. They are in the process of finding a place together, somewhere neither of them has lived before, a fresh start. Joel called me on a Sunday, the way he used to, and we talked for almost 2 hours. He told me about the years. He told me what it felt like to be gone. He told me about the nights he would walk outside and look at the sky and think about me, about whether I was okay, about whether Colton knew how much he was loved. I told him that Colton had always known. I had made sure of that in every visit, every video call, every birthday card. Joel is coming to Clarksville for Thanksgiving. He asked me if I still make the cornbread stuffing the way his grandmother did. I told him I do. I told him I make it every year, whether I feel like eating it or not, because some things you keep doing out of faith, that the table won't always be empty. Before we hung up, he said, "Dad, I have to ask, how did you not give up?" I thought about it for a moment. I thought about that index card on my kitchen table. I thought about lying awake at 2 in the morning with something I couldn't name pressing against my chest. I thought about a voice on a voicemail I'd listened to 400 times. I told him the truth. I said I didn't know how to give up on him. I said I genuinely tried to let go, to move on, to accept it. But some part of me never stopped listening for him. Like a frequency I couldn't tune out, no matter how much time passed or how much sense it made to stop. There are people in your life who you carry inside you so completely that losing them doesn't feel like loss. It feels like missing a limb. You know it's gone. Everyone can see it's gone, but you still wake up in the morning reaching for it. If you were in a situation right now where something feels wrong and everyone is telling you you're imagining it, I want you to hear me. Your instincts are data. They are information gathered over a lifetime that your brain processes faster than your conscious mind can follow. Do not let anyone convince you that your grief makes you unreliable, that your love makes you irrational, that the thing you feel in your chest is just wishful thinking. Sometimes it is wishful thinking, I know that, but sometimes it's your son,